let me introduce our panel, which is another one of those that I've been particularly looking forward to. Some people in this election year talk about themselves as being political junkies. I confess I'm a bit of a government junkie. And in that regard, I think one of the most fascinating experiences right now is to see how a piece of legislation that we've already heard a fair amount about over the last day, and you'll be hearing a lot more now, AB 32, is being implemented. I think it's one of the most exciting, novel, and daunting governance tasks certainly in the history of the state of California and probably in the history of the United States. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed moderator, and that is Nicholas Van Aelstyn. Nico is a principal in the law firm of Beveridge and Diamond here in San Francisco, where he co-chairs the firm's climate change and its subsurface contamination and Superfund practice groups. Nico has been actively involved in the stakeholder process to implement AB 32 here in California, has been involved in the Western Climate Initiative's efforts to develop a regional cap and trade program, as well as legislative actions in the United States Congress to address climate change. And Nico, the floor is yours, and take it away.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Does this work? Good. I'm going to see if this will work from here, because I'd like to stay with our panel and have more of a conversation this morning, if we can. I'll be introducing each of our speakers before each of them speaks. We're going to each speak shortly, and then hopefully open it up to more of a dialogue. It's fallen to me the task of the policeman on the panel this morning to try to keep us on track, and also to give the overview of where we are. And I apologize in advance. I know that this will be somewhat rudimentary for many of you that have been following AB 32, but I'll just give the quick overview first. And first, let me see if this works. No, it doesn't. Okay. I guess I got to go up there. Does this work to advance the slide? Oh, that key. Okay. Okay. Will it work now?
I hope so.
Okay. Okay, AB 32, the Governator. As you'll see from my short talk here, that is a completely inappropriate image, and yet we can't resist. It's a fun one, and you'll see why shortly. AB 32 really is, first of all, it's aspirational and a framework. And it's not a complete regulatory program, as we know. That's why we're here today. But the targets are to reach 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020, and to get 80% below that by 2050. Those are very ambitious goals. I do want to note, though, that they are slightly less ambitious than those of the Kyoto Protocol, to put it in context. It mandates the development of emission reduction measures, monitoring and reporting of emissions by sources of significance, and does require early action measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions while the program is getting up and running. We're not going to wait. We're going to require that certain measures be taken right away. And most importantly, it delegates a tremendous amount of authority to the California Air Resources Board, CARB. Oop, wrong way. Okay, here's what's key. What it does not do. AB 32 has gotten lots of attention, and everybody thinks, oh, wow, great new climate change law. Well, there's a lot that's very important that it does not do. A lot of people like to think, oh, it's a cap and trade bill. Wrong. Cap and trade is allowed, but it is not mandated. Similarly, it did not set the 1990 baseline or the 2020 cap. It does not define what a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions is. And it did not determine any specific greenhouse gas reduction measure. What it did was to delegate all of that authority to do all of those important substantive things with regard to climate change to CARB. That's why we're here. This is the basic overview of the schedule for implementing. It established this goal, and it is a mandatory goal, and it established a rather aggressive timeline to achieve that goal, and CARB is the entity to do that. And these are the various steps along the way. listing early actions. First up, mandatory reporting scoping plan. And we are making progress. CARB did identify 3 discrete early actions to be undertaken, along with a longer list that's on a slower timeline. That was rather controversial and occurred around the same time that there was a change in the executive officer at CARB, so it was somewhat tied up in that. And then we got our new chair and a new new chair of the Air Resources Board, not the new executive officer, last summer. And one of Mary Nicholas's first actions was to increase the list of discrete early actions from 3 to 9. That has now been approved. First check on the box of things that was to be done. By the end of the year, they were to establish the cap. Check. That was done. 427 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. That's the magic number. That was a technical action, not a rulemaking. Interesting point. Mandatory regulatory regs. That was done. Check. So now that brings us to the main activity, which is going on now for a deadline of year-end, January 1, 2009, and that is the scoping plan. And that is essentially the blueprint for implementing AB 32. How is it done? First, a note on process. Workshops, workshops, workshops. That's the bottom line. And this is why my little joke about the governor image being completely wrong. Democracy is a messy business, particularly perhaps in California. But it's a very inspiring one, I have to say, having now been involved as a stakeholder. There are lots of workshops, lots of public opportunities for public input, and believe me, it's happening. Lots of workshops, advisory committees, draft reports. They're put out there, they're commented upon, there are meetings upon that, the final reports, and then ultimately leading to the development of regulations. Those regulations are going forward by way of one example of one of the deadlines that was met, the reporting regulations. Those were approved, and now they're being reworked and revised and subject to further rounds of public input with a goal then for going to the Office of Administrative Law for implementation and actual regs later on. So that's kind of the process that's underway, and here's where the real action is now in terms of that process that's actually more in the public input stage, and that is the scoping plan, the blueprint, as I say, for implementation of AB 32. The first phase is what I like to call research and development, and that was mostly last year and early part of this year, and that's getting input from lots of different sources and different studies. I'm not going to rattle through them all. They've been in the news quite a bit. But in terms of the development of the scoping plan, that is, as I say, it's really the blueprint. These are a list of major stakeholders and groups that had input, the Climate Action Team, the Cal EPA Market Advisory Committee. We could talk for hours about each one of these and the different substantive political issues and other things that went into each of them. Here's where we are. This is the real action now in terms of implementing the scoping plan. There have already been a great deal of workshops. There are different little parallel tracks of committees that each are having their own series of workshops, all overseen by CARB. These workshops are mostly happening in Sacramento, but they're taking them around the state, and they are going forward. The big target date, bold on here, June 26, 2008. If you take away nothing from this panel, from my talk, take away that date. That is the date on which substantive decisions on many of the hot issues, tentative, draft, subject to further rounds of public input, don't worry, will be announced. And that's when the real fighting is going to begin, because so far it's been more theoretical. A lot of these big issues that were essentially punted on by the legislature in order to get AB 32 passed, such as carbon tax, market-based system, command and control regs, all of those different big issues, environmental justice, they're all punted to CARB. Now CARB's dealing with them, still in the abstract. June 26th, they're going to have to announce actual tentative decisions on a lot of these points. That's when the abstract fighting starts to become more substantive, and things are going to get a little more bitter than they already are. So what are some of these hot issues that are going to be, that are already percolating, again, as I say, in a little somewhat more abstract mode, but are going to get a lot thornier after June 26. Credit for voluntary early actions. How to do that? How to give credit? A lot of our clients, want credit for the work that they did, good work that they did to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the 80s, 90s, early part of this century. How is that going to be done? Land use regulations. We'll hear from Tony about that. On and on and on, just down this list. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed ahead to what has perhaps been, perhaps unduly, but nonetheless one of the hottest issues. Offsets. And this has become shorthand for a lot of people for the market, for our cap and trade emissions market. It's only one element of a market. Obviously, the substantial portion of any emissions trading market will be allowances, but offsets are a major feature, and there's been an awful lot of debate. AB 32 does mandate that they be considered in the scoping plan, that methodologies be developed for offsets, and that they meet what are now written in stone standards for offsets, namely that they be real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, enforceable, and additional. Each one of those terms is a term that has inspired countless hours of debate by the carbon geeks of the world, which I include myself. But the big issues are essentially threefold: to have or to have not. Are we going to include offsets trading in any emissions trading, assuming we have emissions trading? Will there be quantity limits on their use by emitters? Will there be geographic limits should they be allowed? California only within the Western Climate Initiative states. MOUs with RGGI, that's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of the Northeast, and their approach to offsets is to sharply limit them in terms of quantity and to allow them only within the RGGI states and in those states with which they have memorandums of understanding, MOUs. That's an approach that California could adopt as well. International, so much of the work that's being done in the area of offsets is through the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, in Europe and in the developing countries. Should those be included? Linkage, another big issue. Another big issue that's been much more in the press is the issue of environmental justice, and that too, again, classic punting, is mandated in AB 32 that it be addressed. And so it is being addressed. I think somewhat artificially, but nonetheless, substantively, the political discourse in the state is largely focused around kind of EJ versus offsets. And we'll see if our panelists agree with that or not. Maximizing co-benefits is another major issue, and this is one of the places where this comes into shape. Should we maximize social, environmental co-benefits, economic co-benefits, when considering how to implement AB 32? Again, it's required that we do that under AB 32. So there's awful lot of work yet to be done on a lot of these different issues. We can talk about each of them. I'm really more just flagging them now to show you that this is a very active process. It's about to get even more active and more ugly in some respects. And yet, it may be all for naught. The legislature, in adopting AB 32, as I say, the outset kind of punted to CARB to give it the opportunity to develop this program. And thus far, the legislature has, for the most part, stood by to see if CARB would develop it in a way with which the state is happy. Nothing is going to, no one's to say that they won't change their mind and decide to weigh in and pass new laws and start doing things on their own. Could very well happen. There have already been a number of indications. Most recently, the letter from Senator Don Parada and others to the governor. And then, of course, there's Washington, D.C. All of this could be preempted. All of this great leadership by the state of California, if the Warner-Lieberman bill passes, and they're talking now about having 60 votes, who knows? Maybe this could all be preempted, and we could find ourselves in that interesting territory of environmental federalism that Professor Carlson has written a great deal about. And so that's the end of the quick overview, which has just raised many more questions than this panel can possibly address. And with that wide open introduction, I'm going to try to now introduce our panelists. I'd like to introduce each of them before they speak. We'll hear first from Professor Hanemann here at Berkeley. And Michael Hanemann is a Chancellor's Professor and Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics, but most interestingly, in addition to having a truly remarkable collection of advanced degrees from minor institutions like Oxford, Harvard, London School of Economics. He is the director of the California Climate Change Center here at UC Berkeley, and co-directed, along with Professor Alex Farrell, the study on managing greenhouse gases in California that was quite influential, and he was also on the organizing team for the 2006 Governor's Climate Scenario Report. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Hanemann.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I must say Steve Chu gave a wonderful talk on the economics of climate change. I want to talk about AB 32, and I want to say a few words about adaptation. The main issue I want to raise with AB 32 is the tension between cap and trade versus regulation of emissions. There's tremendous enthusiasm for emission trading. Partly this is a case of an idea catching fire and capturing the imagination of politicians and legislators and many groups. There are two other reasons behind the enthusiasm. One is, in terms of economic theory, there's a very clear-cut case for preferring emission trading. And the other is that emission trading was incredibly successful, particularly with the Clean Air Act in reducing SO2 and NOx emissions by more than 50% in just a few years at a much lower cost than anybody had anticipated. I want to argue, however, that that is not a good guide in terms of what we can expect with greenhouse gas emissions. For reasons that I'll explain in a moment, the theoretical basis, in fact, is flawed. And the empirical evidence, I think, is misinterpreted. And so I want to explain briefly the reasons for my concern. To start with the sort of anatomy of cap and trading. Under a cap and trade system, actors fall into two groups. Some actors face a cap on their emissions, specifically. In addition, they face a price signal. If they reduce emissions below the cap, they can make a buck, they can make money by selling into the market. And if they can't meet that cap, they can buy at a price permits which would bring them in compliance. So they have a cap and they face a price signal. Other actors throughout the economy just face a price signal. These are actors who don't themselves have a cap, but they face a higher price for commodities, for inputs, for energy, or whatever, because of the cap someplace else in the economy, which has created a scarcity that in turn has generated a price signal. So some actors have a cap, others have a price signal. The precise allocation of those two roles depends on the system. So if you have a carbon tax, nobody has a cap, everybody faces a price signal. If you have an upstream cap and trade, the sectors that bring fossil fuels into the economy, oil refining, coal mining, and so on, have a cap. The rest of the economy just faces price signals. If you have downstream caps, for example, under Pavley, the automobile manufacturers would have a cap, or in the EU system, large sources, cement factories, oil refineries, and so on, have caps, then those firms have caps, but the other actors in the economy just have price signals. So the balance depends on what the scheme is and where the cap is placed. So the question is, so does it make a difference who's what? Does it make a difference whether you have a cap or you have a price signal? In theory, in economic theory, the answer is no, because a cap is sort of equivalent to a sort of a shadow price signal. And in the standard analysis of economic theory, prices are what drives behavior, and either direct or implicit prices trigger behavior. In the real world, this is not true. In the real world, the empirical evidence is it makes a difference whether you actually have a cap, an implicit price, or an explicit price. And there's evidence, I think, that the cap is more potent than the price signal. Now, this is part of work that I'm doing, trying to look back at SO2 trading and ask what actually drove things. Was it the cap or was it the trade that drove behavior? To summarize the evidence very, very simply, if you look at what happened with SO2, if you look at what happened with lead in petroleum, and if you look at CFCs, in every case, the producer who was directly regulated, the producer who faced a regulatory cap, fixed the problem by reformulating the product or by changing the production process in such a way that reduced the emissions at maybe some cost, but not a very great cost. And for everybody else in the economy, life continued more or less the same. So oil companies reformulated lead to make it unleaded, and the rest of us could buy gasoline and drive as much as we wanted without being pushed out of shape. The same was true with SO2. The electric utilities changed the dispatch order. They switched to low sulfur coal. They installed scrubbers, or when they were building new power plants, they built natural gas instead of coal. And there was essentially minimal impact on consumers of electricity and minimal impact on the consumption of electricity. Energy conservation, energy efficiency played no role in the tremendous reduction in SO2 emissions. Renewables played no role in that reduction, and new technologies played no role. Scrubbers were a 30-year-old technology that were well understood, so technological innovation and behavioral change played absolutely no role. The actors who acted were the 200-300 owners of large power plants, and essentially the rest of the economy went through life as usual. That's how these things worked, and that's why I think the cap actually was driving the behavior. The bad news is that for greenhouse gases, this is not going to work. We don't have low-carbon coal. We don't have scrubbers. CCS is in its infancy, with no actual examples of electricity generation yet in operation in the world. If we are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to have a major role for changing behavior, for energy efficiency, for developing and implementing new technologies. This is a completely different challenge than the one we successfully overcame with SO2 or NOx or CFCs or lead in petroleum. To make those changes, I think, we need performance standards. We need regulatory approaches, like the Renewable Portfolio Standard, like the Solar Initiative, like the procurement standard for new power plants, like the efficiency regulations for buildings and appliances and so on. I think we need the pressure of regulatory approaches. Now, two qualifications. The regulatory approaches need to be performance standards as much as possible, need to focus on goals, and secondly, then does still need to be an emissions market, and it will play a role in the background. There needs to be an incentive for parts of the economy that are not regulated to make some money if they can find ways to reduce emissions. But I see that regulation will play a much larger role, in fact, an essential role, than was the case previously with air pollution. Let me switch briefly to, I think the AB 1493 is a nice example. It's a regulation on manufacturers governing their emissions. It's a performance standard, but allows them to come into compliance by paying for emission reductions elsewhere in the economy. So it's a downstream cap. And I think that is a good template for what will be needed. Let me switch briefly to adaptation. I want to make two main points. One is climate change is one of many stresses that we face, and at least for most of this century, it may not be the largest stress. Take water. The largest stress is population growth. As we grow to 50 million or 70 million during this century, our water demands will grow. Even with conservation, there will be a substantial likely increase in the amount of water we want to use. Climate change will reduce the effective supply of surface water we get as our snowpack goes away, as we lose storage. But the reduction in supply is significantly smaller than the increase in demand from population growth. And so in that sense, climate change is not the largest stress. But it may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It will come on top of an increasingly stressed system, and it has features which themselves are very stressful. That is, the increase in variability, the increase in uncertainty in supply, and as I'll indicate in a moment, it will stress our institutions in a number of ways. Let me give three quick examples. In addition to extra demand for water, stream flow will decline and the timing of stream flow will change. Most of the water used in California, 3/4 of all water used in California is used between April and September. Most of the water rights, therefore, for surface water diversions are to divert between April and September. But we will lose maybe half or more of the stream flow that normally occurs in April, May, June, July. It will move forward in time to February and March. People don't have water rights for that. So two things. You could say, well, shift the water rights. But that's non-trivial in our system. Moreover, we do a lousy job of recording water diversions. As you may know, every water user in California is required to file a report on water diversions, but there is no sanction for not filing the report, and many don't. And many of the people who file reports correctly enter their name and address, but leave the rest of the report blank. That's fine. The water users like being left alone. They want to be alone. But that's going to be a mess if suddenly we find major reductions in stream flow and then a need to reallocate water. Groundwater. We don't regulate groundwater in California, and that's worked fine, but not when there's increasing stress on surface water and will be greatly increased use of groundwater. Land use. Smart growth is going to be an essential part, not for 2020, but for 2050 in reducing our emissions. We don't do land use in California or the United States. Moreover, with sea level rise, we'll have to build seawall protections, but we're not going to be able to protect every last square inch of land. Land is going to have to be surrendered. We're going to have to move infrastructure. That requires some sort of consensus on land use and shifting land use. And in a loosey-goosey structure where we sort of really have fragmented and decentralized land use, and land use control is really kind of reflects what people do rather than placing a binding constraint, that's not a great system for dealing with the need to literally reshape the pattern of land use and abandon. Insurance, flood insurance is a total mess. Well, that's not going to be great with an increased likelihood of storms. We need to fix these things. Let me end with the last point. It's been pointed out correctly that a lot of adaptation is really no-regrets policies. We need to improve land use. We need planning. We need to get water rights in better shape and so on. So these are no-regrets policies. But this is what concerns me. The fact that after 50 years or more we haven't fixed these things is great cause for concern about our ability to turn around now, and now that we are sort of miraculously aware of sea level rise and climate change, our ability to turn around and fix these things. The point that we haven't adopted no-regrets policies up to now is, to me, an indication of the enormous challenge we face as a state and as a country in preparing to deal with adaptation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hanemann. Well, I think we've just raised many more questions, and in particular raised some very good questions for our next speaker, Tony Brunello, Tony is the Deputy Secretary for Climate Change and Energy at the California Resources Agency. The California Resources Agency does not have the high profile that, say, Cal EPA does or CARB does, but it is probably one of the most important agencies in the state, particularly with regard to land use, which, as we've just heard from Professor Hanemann, is a very vexing issue when it comes to climate change and will become increasingly so. So I'm very pleased to have Tony on the panel today to speak to us, and particularly in light of the fact that for all of Professor Hanemann's brilliance and Professor Carlson's brilliance and my brilliance, it's Tony is the guy in government who actually gets to make decisions. So Tony, if you could speak.
Great. Actually, and I might just stand up front just so people don't fall asleep. So. I'm a bureaucrat. I can't talk without my PowerPoint. Svetlana had one, I think, that was up there. There was a... Oh, there you go. Perfect. Anyway, I was going to make it easy. I was given a note that I have 10 minutes. I have a clock that just started that none of you can see here, as well as following Dr. Chu, Hanemann, and Nico. I thought it'd be easier for you just to put it in 3 words. Cap and trade. Thank you.
Okay, moving on.
Again, I'm a bureaucrat. You didn't think it'd be that easy, did you? So, no, I wanted to start with that, mainly in the sense that when people start talking about climate change, it very often moves to cap and trade. And it is much broader than just the cap and trade issue, as I know that Michael and Nico had mentioned. But I don't want you to be disheartened that it is an important aspect of it, and many people are dying over their sword on what is included on a cap and trade. But I connect very closely with what Michael has mentioned today, as well as Dr. Chu, on the aspect of it's much broader. And I think one of the things, I just want to fit with my things of 3s. It's always nice to go in 3s. It's important to remember that AB 32, we are getting into the details. And actually, I wanted to get a show of hands. How many people in the audience have looked into AB 32 and have been confused of figuring out either what's in AB 32 or what we're doing? And I have my hand up too. And I'm right in the middle of everything. So this is an important note that AB 32, what is important is it's really a call to action. It's something that we've said, we've realized that there are impacts, we realize that there's something that needs to be done, and it's saying, here's a first step. So I want to stress that in the discussions that if you looked at all the panels, and thank God, Nico didn't realize he was set up. We had a call last Wednesday, and we kind of framed him to put some of those PowerPoints up. And everybody from ARB has to put the same slides up to talk about time frames, what can we do, and what's going to come out of AB 32. But we all realize it's a daunting process. We have a timeline that is very unreasonable, but it was set up in AB 32. But again, it goes back to, you should always remember, the important point is it's a first step, and it's really to take action is most important. So don't get lost in all the details and think where it's going is way off in left field. Important is just to think that it's a first step. So I'll talk a little bit about it. It's also important to note that AB 32 is focused on largely the mitigation side. And so for the next point, I just want to briefly, again, I've got 10 minutes, so we'll see how quick I can blow through these. But adaptation is a really key point, and it's not the point that says you don't act on mitigation. You have to have both. You have to have mitigation and adaptation. And right now, where our emphasis has been on the mitigation side. But as Michael said, it's dumb without including an adaptation strategy as well. Finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit, and actually I might have changed this, but to talk a little bit about land use. But I'm going to punt everything to Bill and the next panel session that's going to talk a little bit more about land use. But I can say I just came back from a 3-day meeting that was in Monterey that got a lot of people together from the Air Resources Board and from any developer, any group that has an interest in land use across the state to discuss what should be done in the scoping plan. And I could say I'm more confused than I am enheartened, but I'll talk a little bit more on what I see as some of the challenges and opportunities. So again, I'm going to focus at more of a 30,000 feet so we can go into discussions, but really important for you to know in AB 32, because this is the mind of a bureaucrat, this is where we are, is looking at that 2020 number. Right here, we're spending a lot of time on figuring out how to reach this 173 million metric tons. So it has narrowed down from a complicated issue to reaching 173. And there's problems in that, but that's what the statute says. And if we're talking about implementing, that's where we're going. So this chart, you can go back and research it later, that it says a lot, but what's really important is you're try and reach that 173 target. And then you can see here, many of us are already beyond this, trying to look at 2050. And exactly as Michael said, land use is, that's a big one as you start looking out past 2020. So these are, and this is another thing Rick knew of having somebody from the resources agency that I get to throw my little barbs at CARB on some of their aspects. In the end, when you want to provide focus, this pie chart does it. This is what ARB has to do. They need to figure out how to fill this pie chart. And right now, they have already reached the 30 million metric tons to reach that original 173 I'd mentioned. There's 16 that get the discrete early actions. There's 26 looking at, sorry, I messed that up. Most important is the 101. 101 is what we're looking at, that you're going to have an idea of what that plan will be by ARB on, I didn't even know that date, June 26th, was that one? That's when I need to write that on my calendar. But that's very important because that's the first shot out for how ARB is going to actually say that they're going to implement that. Cap and trade, looking at the water sector, forestry sector, electricity sector, all these things are going to be in there to say, how do we reach that 101 target? So again, to put that in perspective, that's what's going to come out in June. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the next couple months. It's not going to be the prettiest document, I'm assuming, but it's going to be a first cut and will be worthwhile for some of you to read through, and we'll have about 6 months to critique and figure out next steps. Now, I had this up front before, but actually this is kind of important to be thinking about. Here are the emissions, the sector emissions from California. This is 2004. So you can see where our emissions are coming from. And what's really important was my first comment that it's not just AB 32. We all get that. And Michael had mentioned some of the other things that we're working on to reduce emissions across the state. The Renewable Portfolio Standard. We're trying to reach 20% of our electricity supply to be renewables by 2010. Very difficult to do, but that's something that we need to try and push for. Transportation is another key one that all of us are trying to look at right now. And it's really, the way it's been presented is a three-legged stool. One is to look at the actual cars and what comes out of the tailpipe. And many of you are aware of the Pavley legislation and things that are going on in the federal EPA and how they're blocking some of the efforts that we have. That's one, looking at the actual car. We're also looking at fuels. Many of you have heard of the low carbon fuel standard. This is fundamental to figure out what type of fuels do we want for the future. Dr. Chu, I mean, cutting edge is in that type of research of how we're going to provide fuel for transport. Third is the one that most of us are racking our head about right now in terms of what could be included in the scoping plan, and it relates to what I'll end with. Vehicle miles traveled is the final one, of looking at how people drive across the state, sprawl. And again, I hope the next session will deal with this a little bit more. I see Bill laughing. He knows after our session I want to punt all of that to him. But really, land use addresses all of these sectors of where we're trying to reduce emissions. It also is where the rubber hits the road for how we reduce emissions, but also how we adapt for the future. And as Michael said, AB 32 is bringing new attention to existing issues. And again, I'll get to that. Finally, again, I just wanted to raise that, as it was already stated by Nika, so I can blow through this, but what the scoping plan in AB 32 is trying to do is trying to balance regulations, incentives, market-based systems on hitting that 101 target. And again, I think what our mindset is that It's not going to be the rocket science plan that everybody in the world is going to copy and we'll go from there. It's a first cut for California that we hope will provide leadership and a real vision for where we need to go. So with that, that's sort of the mitigation, and we'll talk more on that. Dr. Chu, Michael Hanemann, both talked about water. Water is a fundamental issue when we start looking at adaptation. Actually, I keep wanting to say adaption. Gavin Newsom, if anybody were at a UC Hastings workshop last Friday, was absolutely brilliant. I'd never heard him talk before, but I was exceptionally impressed talking about mitigation and adaptation. But he kept using the word adaption, and now all of us have been saying adaption. So, but this map more or less says it. And I think, I know Ryan Broderick will be speaking the next session, and there'll be much more discussion on the water side. But this is an important map. This shows Northern California. The box is for our delta. Now, up in the mountains is where we get most of our water. What happens? It flows through the delta and then goes to 25 million people for drinking water, industry, for all efforts. The delta is really the throughway, and Rick Frank sits on our delta vision that's trying to figure out a better way to balance all of the interests for the water that we have for biodiversity, economic growth, and for trying to feed the demand of future population growth. But we have problems. We not only have problems right now of well, all types of problems that have already been discussed, but climate change is an added pressure to that water system, and it's a long-term one. So again, I'm going to show you a couple graphs that show up in the mountains where we're going to have reduced water, but the other side is looking at the bay. Sea level rise. Sea level rise is a major issue of how it will intrude into the delta, and with salt water mixing with fresh water causes a few issues. And right now, literally, it's a fundamental topic that we're trying to address on sea level rise. How do you plan? We're looking at current investments in our water infrastructure over the next 50 years, and we're looking at over $12 to $15 billion potentially. And we need to figure out how sea level rise might affect how big, if you have new dams, which who knows if that will happen, how high would they have to be? What type of levees do you have to build? All of these sessions. So when you look at, in the future, snowpack, and again, I'm not going to go into detail on these, but it's reducing in the mountains. You can see that projections from the IPCC show we'll have about 20% remaining in 2100. Sea level rise in the past, we're already seeing it in San Francisco. This is from 1900 to 2000. It's already been an 8-inch increase. In the future, it looks like it's going to be a lot more. So that then leads us to this great map from Will Travis at BCDC. If you have not seen this, you should pull it up, do a Google search. This shows a meter sea level rise out to 2100. And they just did as a static map that shows where sea level rise will be in the Bay Area. San Francisco Airport, again, I have to scare you. I'm talking about climate change. It's either polar bears or airports, so I had to put this one in. But it does show that the San Francisco Airport would be underwater. Oakland Airport, underwater. So if you're looking for future planning efforts, you need to obviously start thinking about what sea level rise might be. Gavin Newsom had mentioned he's going to put a band around Alcatraz Island to show where these sea level projections are, just to get more attention so people can think about how it affects their individual decisions. But how do you make those changes for both the mitigation side of reducing greenhouse gases, as well as trying to plan for the future of how you might shift your development down from where sea level rise will hit up a little bit further? It starts getting complicated, and it gets into the land use side, which I think is a little more complicated than reaching the 101 target that we have here. And this is where it also gets to the local involvement, where what really needs to happen is looking at, I'm just going to go into a couple brief slides on looking at land use. There are, in the land use sector, you first, if you want to make change, you need to work with what you have, some of the existing problems that are already there. We have disincentives for developing smart growth. Proposition 13, which was passed many years ago, has an adverse tax system that doesn't really promote some of the goals people would want for climate change. Existing zoning across the state, that's the responsibility of local entities. Having a regional or state governments come in and actually try and impose mitigation requirements is toxic, and it's something that I know our Air Resources Board knows quite well, and they're trying to balance what could you reasonably do to try and get people to do the right thing. Housing laws, and then CEQA. And I'll point, Kirk Miller, who's our general counsel from the Resources Agency, is here and is leading a charge where we're just trying to, and I don't know if you raise your hand if anybody wanted to come up, but Kirk is leading a charge within our Resources Agency to try and identify how you incorporate greenhouse gas requirements in CEQA. And so he's working with OPR to try and figure out how we better do that over the next couple of years. But what we need, and this came out of this group, it's not just AB 32 coming up with solutions. You also need state money. You need some incentives for getting people to do the right thing. A hammer doesn't work. So a lot of people are focusing on transportation dollars. And you know, I'll point to Bill again. Hopefully they go over this a little bit, but that's something that people are trying to wrestle with. You need new legislation. If any of you are interested in the topic and have heard of, it's called Senate Bill 375. This is the hot topic. This is what everybody is focusing on right now. This is what people are lobbying on. They're putting a lot of money towards a bill that was that's being proposed by Senator Steinberg. And this is one that everybody is sort of rallying around at the moment. We have no position with the administration yet, frankly, because it's too hard to read. But it's a lot of information in there. And so, but what it raises is that just AB 32 by itself is not enough to get to the targets that we want in the land use sector. So there may need to be new types of legislation. And most important, this is just screaming out all the time. Not only do you need more awareness across the state of people just figuring out what the heck we're talking about. I mean, we work a lot on focusing on adaptation. And people are often, if people have not heard a discussion of that, are just looking at me as though I've just had some crack pipe or something. That awareness is very low, and I think it's a continual process of bringing people more understanding of what the impacts might be and what they can do about it. But leadership is the other thing. I've spoken to many local officials of just trying to understand what can they do at that local level, rather than just pointing to ARB or at the state level, which I would recommend nobody do. It's really what can you do at those local levels. So again, I'm over time. I just wanted to end with the positive note, because it's easy to get on the negative side. There are opportunities, potentially, in both the mitigation and adaptation fronts. And this is the part where we've been looking at, it's what the governor promoted, is that there are new opportunities, for example, at Lawrence Livermore Labs to promote new technologies that could be applied around the globe. We should be looking into that and figuring out how California can be a leader to develop solutions. Another issue that's really important was, yesterday I was at a League of Cities meeting, and everybody who was there from across the state said specifically that they have never seen the level of cooperation on focusing on this land use issue in particular. There is a sense of urgency, there's a sense of impending legislation. People are interested and focused on working together in times that they've never done in the past. There is a possibility of putting guns at the door solutions. People who have died on their sword for CEQA, for example, are now talking about, you know what, if we had better infill, or better development options, we might think about maybe different solutions for CEQA. That's a toxic issue from what I understand in the past, and it's really, it has not always been done. So there are some opportunities there. And finally, the fact that greenhouse gases affect the entire state and link us to national and international levels is fundamental to why people are actually interested to try and do new things they haven't done in the past. So anyway, I've talked too long. I can see by my clock. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Tony. It was inspiring talk, except troubling. He's not the governor either. We don't seem to have those with. There's not a dictator. It's democracy. We need leadership at all levels, and it's going to be difficult. Our next speaker is Professor Ann Carlson. She's a professor of law and the faculty director at the Emmett Center on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA. She's also on the faculty of the UCLA School of the Environment. Professor Carlson is going to talk with us today about where some of this rubber hits the road in a particular case study. All three of our talks thus far have been at a more theoretical level. Professor Carlson is going to bring us down to the ground a little bit with one particular institution that's trying to deal with these challenges. Tony Brunello talked about AB 32 being a first step. Well, it's a first step in a sprint at this point that's been posing great challenges for many on the ground. And Professor Carlson, if you could talk about that for us.
I have the remote there? Can you show me how to work? That advances, okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Nico. So in many respects, I think it's worth thinking about AB 32 in kind of parallel ways to where we were with major environmental statutes in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Congress made very bold moves to address water pollution, air pollution, and so forth by passing sweeping statutes, often with very ambitious goals. And then thinking about where we are today with those federal statutes. Those federal statutes, obviously those were really dramatic watershed moments, but the hard work in implementing them is continuing today. So if we think almost 40 years later that we remain out of compliance with many of the standards in the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, the EPA is only beginning to regulate certain sources under those two statutes. That's the sort of picture I want to paint and getting you to think about what's going to happen once the ARB actually decides how we're going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, how on-the-ground sources are actually going to deal with those regulatory challenges. And so I'm going to have you take a look at what's going on right now and thinking about how the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is going to deal with greenhouse gas emissions cuts, not just, again, under AB 32, but under a couple of other very significant bills. AB 32, I'm sorry, the LADWP is a pretty interesting entity in a lot of respects. It's the largest municipally owned utility in the country. And let me give you some facts about it. It serves the customers of the city of Los Angeles, so its customer base roughly tracks the population of the city of LA, not the county of LA, which is why it's 3.8 million customers and not 6 million customers. The utility owns its own transmission and distribution lines and produces much of its own electricity through utility-owned natural gas facilities in the South Coast Basin and so forth. Because it's a municipal entity, it's governed by a board that's appointed by the mayor. It's not just that the board is appointed by the mayor, but things like rate increases also need to be approved by the city council and by the mayor of Los Angeles, which poses particularly interesting challenges if you think about the cost increases that are likely to result from a lot of the climate change legislation. There's some numbers up here that just give you a sense of how large this entity actually is. 6,000 miles of above-ground transmission lines, 4,000 miles underground, 7,000 megawatts of electric capacity, and so forth. This is a giant entity, and that's just the electricity side. This is also the Department of Water and Power. As someone said, LADWP is also the owner of Owens Valley, if you think about the DWP history. But I'm going to concentrate here on the electricity side. So let me give you a little bit of information about the legislation that's most likely to affect DWP. We've talked a lot about AB 32 already. It's important to note that AB 32 covers not only generation but also transmission, and not only in-state supplies but also out-of-state supplies, quite important to LADWP, which imports a significant amount of coal from Utah. Two other pieces of legislation that are quite significant to the utility. One is SB 1368, which passed at the same time as AB 32. Many of you probably already are aware of this, but it is something that gets little attention in comparison with AB 32. But it prevents utilities from entering into long-range contracts to produce electricity unless that electricity is roughly as clean as very efficient natural gas facilities. That's a big problem for LADWP, which again imports a significant amount of coal. I have my phone out right now to tell me the time, and my sister is calling me as I speak, so a little distracted for the moment there. Her picture comes up on it, so she's just looking at me. And then finally, Michael Hanemann already mentioned renewable portfolio standards. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is actually, because for complicated reasons, it's actually not subject to the state standard, but has adopted its own 20% standard by 2010. That's a very aggressive standard consistent with the state, and Mayor Villaraigosa has committed the city to a 35% standard by 2025. This is roughly equivalent to a similar standard that the governor has proposed for utilities statewide. So these are very significant pieces of legislation. I want to talk now about how the utility is planning to try to meet them. One important note before I go into detail, and that is that DWP is actually quite remarkable in being forward-thinking. This is true, Dr. Chu said this about utilities more generally in the state of California, but I say this because one of the things that you might think about is LADWP looks somewhat similar to the rest of the country in terms of its energy mix. I'll tell you that in a moment, but probably looks quite dissimilar from utilities around the country in the amount of planning and commitment the utility has already made to cutting its carbon emissions. So I'm going to point out problems DWP is going to face, and then I want you to project outward and think about the rest of the country, which is, you know, where many utilities are governed by much less forward-thinking managers and so forth. So let me also start with a little bit of background information about California electricity. Dr. Chu covered some of this, but I'll repeat a little bit of it and then add some new pieces of information. First important piece of information is that California has been incredibly forward-thinking already in making the state much more energy efficient than the rest of the country. This slide shows the difference between what California has done on a per capita basis in energy usage over the past 30-some years compared with the rest of the country that's seen about a 50% increase in energy use per capita. That's not because we're particularly small consumers of electricity as individual people, but instead it's because of things like energy efficiency standards of the sort that Dr. Chu pointed out. Some of those are federal now, so some of those energy efficiency savings are being replicated across the country, but many are California-led. We have much better building standards and so forth. And the result is that we've done already a very good job in maintaining flat consumption of electricity on a per capita basis. Again, it's in part from building codes, appliance standards. It's also actually one of the nice ancillary benefits of the Clean Air Act, where California shifted away from dirtier fuels and relies much more heavily on things like natural gas. So let me show you what California energy usage by fuel type looks like. As you can see, coal is the blue piece of the pie there, much smaller than the national average, which I'll show you, much larger reliance on hydro. That's partially the accident of geography. We actually have hydro resources that are used particularly by Northern California utilities. In contrast, the rest of the country looks like this, about half coal. Coal obviously is a much more carbon-intensive fuel, and so, you know, among other things, our per capita energy usage and carbon emissions are actually much lower than the rest of the country. DWP, however, looks much more like the rest of the country. Okay, here's DWP. That's because, again, a lot of the electricity generated in Southern California actually comes from Utah, from a coal facility in Utah. We're going to have to move away from that usage, in part because of SB 1368, which prohibits entering long-term contracts for energy sources that are more energy or more carbon-intensive than natural gas. So just let me, now you can see them side by side. That's California compared to the DWP. And that's the United States compared to DWP. So one of the reasons it's interesting to look at DWP, I think, is as a lesson for the rest of the country, since we're going to face in Southern California some issues that utilities elsewhere in California are not going to face. As I said earlier, DWP has actually already been thinking a lot about carbon emissions for quite some time, and so I want to give them some credit for that. Since the mid-1990s, the utility has been committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions to 5% below 1990 levels. It's also been planning extensively for not only AB 32, but for the executive order that mandates reductions by 2050 of 80% below 1990 levels. The result of that is that DWP emissions are already 8.6% below 1990 levels. These are carbon emissions. So you'd think, well, the utility should be in pretty good shape. It's already seeming to meet the AB 32 goals. But there are some problems that lie ahead, not surprisingly, and let me tell you a little bit about them. The trend, among other things, is not entirely linear. So, for example, in 2006, emissions were about 1 million tons higher than they were in 2002. There are some fluctuations, but there are also some ominous trends that are going to make meeting the goals more difficult. Among other things, by 2030, it's projected that the County of Los Angeles, which doesn't exactly track the city boundaries, but it's the best population estimate I could find, is going to add about 1.75 million residents and another a total of 3.5 by 2050. So we've got population pressures, which are obviously going to increase the need for more energy at a time when we're trying to reduce emissions. And in addition, demand is increasing, in part because people are locating farther from the coast where there's more open space, and they need air conditioning, among other things. So overall, the DWP is projecting that it's going to need to increase its energy supply by about 30% by 2025, while cutting emissions or holding them steady. So that's a daunting challenge. We're not just staying static, and how DWP intends to do so raises a host of interesting challenges, questions, and value clashes between things like unionized job holders, local environmental concerns that in many respects clash with attempts to reduce carbon emissions dramatically, and so forth. So far, over the course of the next 5 years, DWP is proposing to do a number of things in order to begin to reduce its carbon emissions. Those include, most importantly, trying to comply with the Renewable Portfolio Standard. In addition, there are efforts to retrofit natural gas facilities in the basin in order to make them more efficient. And in doing so, the agency, as I said, is going to face a number of challenges. One thing that's interesting to note is in the short term, there's not going to be a huge reduction in reliance on coal. So all of the problems that I'm going to face ignore the fact that in 2027, when the LADWP contract expires with the Utah facility that provides coal, the utility is going to need to reduce or eliminate its reliance on coal. So I'm going to talk about short-term problems, but this doesn't begin to address what's going to happen over the course of the next 20 years when the utility actually needs to move away entirely from its reliance on coal. So a couple of constraints that LA faces that may, in fact, be quite parallel to what other utilities will face. Among other things, the DWP union of electric utility workers is quite powerful. And one of the things that the union has succeeded in doing is getting the state, or the DWP, to commit to owning at least half of the renewable resources that it relies on. The result, now that may be a great thing. It's certainly something that produces economic opportunities for DWP workers, but it's going to slow the city's progress in trying to meet that RPS standard. And remember, we're talking about 2 years from now, moving from about 8% renewables right now to 20%, so 150% increase over the course of the next year and a half. In addition, Dr. Chu has already mentioned this. He actually talked about the need for transmission. I'm going to talk about some of the problems with trying to create new transmission lines. DWP has purchased land out in the Salton Sea, which is about 90 miles from the city of Los Angeles, in order to develop geothermal resources and probably some wind and solar resources. The problem is we don't have the transmission lines to get that energy back to the customers who need it. There we go. This is a picture of a geothermal project. So the LADWP has proposed building what's called the Green North Project to build 85 miles of transmission lines in order to bring the energy to the Los Angeles area. The problem is that those transmission lines are going to be built through communities that receive no benefits, at least in a localized sense, to the degree that these reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Overall, we all receive benefits, right? But locally, they're going to receive no benefits. And instead, what they're going to get are things like this in their backyard. As you might imagine, this is not a particularly popular proposal among the desert communities through which this transmission line is currently proposed to be built. There are already multiple cities that are on record opposing the Green North project. In addition, the local Republican congressman, Jerry Lewis, has already written a letter to Mayor Villaraigosa opposing the project. And there are countless federal and state statutes that will need to be complied with in order to build this transmission line. There are, the line, among other things, goes through right on the border of Joshua Tree National Monument. It goes across federal lands. There are serious concerns about interference with habitat. There are serious concerns about the aesthetic problems of these giant transmission towers that are going to be built, again, through these desert communities. There are worries about the health effects of transmission lines. And again, the cities that are burdened, and the unincorporated areas of the county that are burdened, don't benefit directly from the production of the electricity. I point this out because this is going to be a problem that repeats itself throughout the country. Dr. Chu talked about the cost of those transmission lines. Imagine also the local opposition to the placement. Now, at least some of these things can be built underground, but building underground has its own disruptions, at least on a temporary basis. So that's a problem with transmission lines. In addition, most of the projects on which DWP is going to rely have yet to be built, the renewable projects. Dr. Chu again also talked about the tremendous increases in efficiency of wind turbines, but all these projects are controversial, again, as a political matter. So wind turbines obviously create aesthetic issues for those communities in which they're located. There are also problems with bird kills and so forth. And the siting of all of these things are going to raise potentially Endangered Species Act habitat problems. They're going to need to comply with things like the California Environmental Quality Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. All of that provides lawsuit opportunities for local environmental groups that oppose these projects. And by the way, Green North Path is opposed, for, among others, by the local chapter, the Sierra Club. So the sort of localized environmental values clashes, or values battles with a problem that is really international in scope and also is really long-term as opposed to short-term, raise real problems, not just, again, for the LADWP, but for any utility that is seeking to shift its energy sources away from conventional sources to renewable sources. Okay, so if that isn't depressing enough, there are also big problems with natural gas in Southern California. Again, another environmental clash. These facilities are located near large bodies of water, not surprisingly in Southern California, the coast. And the LADWP is proposing trying to make these facilities more efficient in order to increase the efficiency we get and lower greenhouse gas emissions from these facilities. A problem, however, is that a number of these facilities are affected by new EPA regulations, actually regulations that have been challenged. So when we talk about how long it took to implement the Clean Water Act, in 2001, more than 30 years after the adoption of the Clean Water Act, the EPA finally began to regulate what's called intake cooling of natural gas facilities, and issued rules that, of course, were then challenged both by industry and by environmental groups as not being stringent enough. Right now there's real serious regulatory limbo about the effect of these rules. But the long and short of it is that these natural gas facilities are no longer going to be able to take in water from the water body in which they're located, heat it up, and then emit it back into the water. It causes all kinds of aquatic problems, kills all sorts of marine life, and so forth. But the solution, the most frequently proposed solution, is to build giant cooling towers that can allow for the taking in of water, but you don't then release it back. You don't take in as much, you don't release it back into the ocean. You can imagine the problem in trying to build intake towers that are 100 feet high in Southern California that's seriously land constrained for facilities that are located on the coast. The cost, among other things, is almost enough to close the facilities down, let alone the aesthetic, political problems that building these intake towers will require. And I haven't even mentioned what might be the most controversial problem of all, and that is the problem of cost. So you may or may not know that Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa is already seriously opposed to the auctioning of emissions credits under AB 32. He says it'll cost the utility $750 million to purchase credits, although we don't know what the price of the credits would be yet. That's the estimate. In addition, all of, to the degree that we try to shift to things like solar energy, that's going to be much more costly. The building of transmission lines is obviously significantly expensive. You put all this together and you've got a board that cannot raise rates without the approval of a politically elected body, that is the city council and ultimately the mayor. DWP has prided itself on providing extremely low-cost energy to its or electricity to its customers, which includes a very poor population base in the city of Los Angeles. So thinking about how the utility is actually going to raise the revenue necessary to meet its obligations under AB 32 and other climate change statutes is really daunting. So I'll just close on that pessimistic note. I also have a few answers. In particular, I think one of the most challenging questions we're going to face is how we balance these conflicting values clashes, local environmental concerns with, how we balance that against an obviously huge international environmental problem, what we do about the fact that shifting from one sort of resource to another may have significant economic implications, not only in rate increases, but also in the jobs that are provided to utility workers and so forth, I think remain extremely important and, at this point, really unanswered questions that we're going to face as we work toward implementing AB 32.
Thank you, Professor Carlson. It's still morning and I need a drink after that. Actually, Professor Carlson, you touched on one item that has been missing from this talk thus far this morning, and that is a little surprising given that we're at a law school, and that is the issue of lawsuits, litigation. Nearly everything that we all touched on in our different talks may be the subject, and in many cases under the CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, already is the subject of intense litigation by many of the parties. You mentioned the Utah power coal plant. They're talking about suing. The provisions of AB 32 that I cited are going to be the subject of lawsuits, mark my words. So that shadow hangs over all of this as well. I guess I have a few questions in mind, but because we're running short on time and you guys have been so patient, I want to open it up to questions to try to see if you all can get engaged and not just us long-winded folks up here on the panel. Please, there are mics here and here, so please feel free to come forward.
So I have a collective question for all of you regarding AB 32, 1493, and treatment of vehicle miles traveled. 1493 actually has a statement in it that land use, vehicle miles traveled from land use is not part of that bill. That's not something that ARB should be regulating through 1493. And AB 32 has a provision that kind of punts to 1493 regarding to transportation. So I'm just wondering what your understanding of that is.
If I could just take a moment, Tony, I think you're probably the best candidate for this, but that just sort of underscores the point that I just made, because that is an area where we've already seen a great deal of litigation, and a lot of folks are looking to courts to decide these things because our agencies, although they're working very fast and hard, are not fast enough for many. So, Tony, if you could comment on this.
We're not moving fast enough. I'm just kidding. Once you get into vehicle miles traveled, all that I'm realizing is you can't just focus on the transportation side of things. It opens up, sort of as I had mentioned, on a number of different issues for existing problems and needing to incorporate with incentives, as well as some other potential regulatory moves. So ARB has been given broad authority under AB 32 to try and implement their standards. Quite broad, and I think they're looking at if there are other bills that can help them meet the targets, then they will hope to push and help to get those as the primary vehicles. Where there's not, I think they'll try and take action where they can to the extent that is reasonable and meets the requirements of AB 32 of still having to be cost effective and equitable, you know, all those things that are very clear in AB 32. But I think, again, I mentioned this bill of, there are other bills that are being proposed that might fill gaps of trying to deal with the VMT issue. And I'm by no means an expert in that, but I at least the sense that they are looking at it very broadly.
In addition to vehicle miles traveled, there's another piece of this which actually is the mode of transportation. So part of this is public transportation within cities so that you have lower emissions per person transported, per mile traveled. There's also intercity travel. And one of the notions that some people have raised is that in future rail and rail powered by electricity might be, with a larger role for renewables, might be desirable compared to both trucking for freight and also sort of air transportation for intercity travel, flying down to LA or whatever. That would require, and there is the notion of a high-speed rail system in California, but that requires a major investment and would take a long time to construct. But I wanted to emphasize this. It's part of this is the shape of cities and urban sprawl, but part of this would be changing both passenger travel and freight travel within cities and between cities. All of this will be expensive and will take time, but we also need to start beginning to plan now, even if it'll take 40 or 50 years to accomplish.
I have some comments, but I'll hold off, except just to flag the San Bernardino County litigation that the Attorney General brought some time ago on that settlement. I mean, once again, it's an example of how the courts are intervening or being forced to intervene effectively to provide precisely the kind of planning that we're not able to do because of the problems that have been mentioned. But, sir.
One can't help but appreciate the progress that's being made and is about to be made under AB 32 and companion measures. But I note that the national elections are soon upon us and the administration is going to change. Legal discussions are taking place in international forums. So my question is, how do the frameworks and the measures being discussed under AB 32 harmonize, say, with a system that looks not at cap and trade, but a carbon tax, for example? How durable is what we're starting to do here in California under a system, say, adopted nationally for a carbon tax or an international convention? Thank you.
So I guess I think the answer is complicated, and obviously we don't know what federal legislation is going to do to whether, for example, California can even adopt a cap and trade system. But lots of the measures, as numerous of our speakers have noted, I think are independent of a carbon tax. AB 1493, which hopefully will be implemented someday, is a good example. But also all of the kind of planning and knowledge strikes me as extraordinarily important for providing lessons, blueprints, and so forth for other jurisdictions, including the national government. And also getting, DWP, again, just to go back to a particular utility, is being forced to contend currently with measures that it will have to take under a federal system or under a state system regardless. And so I think the leadership that California is demonstrating right now is extraordinarily important in getting us moving further and faster at the federal level, ultimately, whether or not the state's regulatory efforts are ultimately preempted.
I'll just add briefly that a carbon tax will be assessed in the scoping plan, but I think, as we all are, and I'm an economist by training, theoretically it makes complete sense. Politically is just, I think, what some people have had a difficulty with.
Well, a carbon tax is equivalent to an upstream cap. And in economic theory, it's it's equivalent to any other system with downstream caps, and administratively, it's simpler than any more complex system with downstream caps. However, empirically, I don't think a carbon tax would create the incentives that would change behavior at all as much as a series of downstream caps. And so, in theory, a carbon tax can do everything with a lower transaction cost than other measures. But that ignores the motivation of people, and that ignores the behavioral side of the response to regulation. And so this is a case where I think the theory is just off base, because it assumes a simple world with a single decision maker, with a single concern, short-run profit. And that's not, the reality is more complicated.
Speaking of the political problems, as cap and trade bills are making progress now in Congress, and on the House side getting less attention, Dingell and Boucher are moving forward with their bill. But to flag this issue, last fall, when things were heating up a bit and a jockeying for position between Speaker Pelosi and Dingell, he floated a carbon tax bill, precisely to show how politically impossible it would be. So whether it is right in theory or not, I think it's politically simply impossible. You also mentioned the international point before our next question. I just want to flag another milestone out there on the horizon, and that's Copenhagen for the next COP, another COP, the Conference of the Parties under the Kyoto Protocol. And that's, you know, the next milestone to head towards for post-2012. Anything we're going to do on a national level has to be tied to that, and that's the next sort of, you know, milestone out there. California has provided incredible leadership in moving the rest of the country and now the national government towards this. But again, if AB 32 is a first step, it's the first step in a sprint from a bureaucratic side or certainly a diplomacy side. So we've got there's a lot to be done. Mama, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. This has been a really great panel. I had a question about smart growth. I'm really very much struck by what all of you have said about the impact of growth just being a huge stress. But it seems it's not only the issue of just the sheer amount of growth, something that's also affecting very much the state I'm from right now, Arizona, but also where that growth happens to locate. And yet so much, it seems, from my own experience, smart growth has been left to local communities. And yet it seems like this growth really needs to be managed at a higher level, at a state level. So I'm just wondering, in California, are there any large movements afoot to deal with these issues on a state level, to deal with sea level rise, to deal with these transportation issues, the air conditioning issue? Because it seems like the environmental justice issues as well, that might be helpful, and it might be a model for those of us in other high-growth states. Thank you.
Well, I think the next panel will probably help out more of that. But I thought what was funny at this land use meeting we had in, it was just the last couple of days, a fellow named Steve Winkleman from Center for Climate Air Policy. He said, you know what I always think is, what would they do in China? And he, you know, and we were talking about smart growth aspects, and of course, you know, they could command and control and figure out where the best things were, and hopefully decrease emissions that way. But it's a, you know, we actually have what's called a democracy here, and it's the local jurisdictions that have the majority of the authority for making land use decisions, and so that's where it's an interesting balance at the state of. Again, I'm quite new, and many in this room have been working on land use issues for many years, but it's trying to have mandates from the top doesn't typically work. So that's why it takes probably new legislation, you need incentives, and you need leadership. And so anyway, that's my quick answer.
Let me just mention one very small piece, but nevertheless a piece, is providing information. And let me give you two examples. One is, as part of the scenarios work done by the Energy Commission and Cali, PA, putting out maps with downscale, spatially detailed projections of future temperature and precipitation and stream flow is sort of a key first step. So individual communities get a sense of what actually will face them 30 or 40 years from now. And that information is only now becoming available, but that's a key first step. Second thing, and for example, for sea level rise, it's beginning also. But let me mention something else. The assumption for water planners in the state has been that water use per capita will decline over time. There's ever more stringent standards for toilets and showers, and the assumption is so that new homes have more efficient toilets and showers. The assumption has been that water use, the rest of the water use will stay the same, and so the net effect is an overall reduction. But in fact, most of the new construction is in interior areas which are hotter. In some cases, not all cases, there's more outdoor, there's bigger yards. There are more toilets per house, per capita, and toilets leak. And so it may be that water use is actually going up per capita in new homes despite the regulation. We don't have real BMPs on outdoor water use, or rather or in fact on new construction. That's been fiercely restricted. And we don't have good data because in any area, new construction is a small fraction of the total housing stock. And so there's not good data available on whether water use is different in new homes than existing homes in water utilities. We have a project at Berkeley collecting that data and trying to analyze it. But if you don't know whether water use is actually going up or going down or whatever, it's hard to get concerned. So with many of these things, part of this is developing information. We will need the political will, but in a sense, we need to start shining a spotlight on these things because raising consciousness is part of the first step.
We'll take one more question, but before I do, I'll just take the prerogative to take a card from Tony Brunello and say there are 3 words with regard to local and regional land use planning that I think govern how it's done here in California. Sue the bastards. That's how so many of these things end up being addressed and resolved, is in the courts. Assemblyman Jones, if we could have one last question.
Thanks. This question's for Michael. The PUC is recommending to CARB that cap and trade be used in the electricity sector as a means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And one question that we had in the Utilities Commission for the PUC, which I don't think was satisfactorily answered, is whether the theoretical efficiencies, cost savings that arguably will attain with cap and trade in a free market or in a competitive market, whether that would still apply in a market which is characterized by monopoly behavior. And the concern I have is electrical utilities can essentially pass rate increases on to consumers as they wish. They basically are regulated monopolies. And I'm wondering whether cap and trade makes sense in that sort of market, because the argument for cap and trade is that you'll induce the most cost-effective producers of greenhouse gas emissions to do that very thing, and those that do so less efficiently will purchase from the more efficient producers. But in a monopolistic market, like the electricity market, large utilities like PG and others who have huge consumer bases on which they can pass these cost increases to buy up greenhouse gas emissions can essentially outcompete smaller regulated monopolies like the munis. And so you have a more distorted market, and you don't obtain the sorts of efficiencies that arguably might apply in a competitive market. And I pose that to an economist because we had no economists in the hearing room at the time, so no one could give me an answer. Well,
my impression, and I'm not an expert on electricity economics, I'm becoming one as time passes and as I get into this literature more, but I don't think the monopoly or oligopoly or structure of electricity has been a major problem so far with SO2, and I don't know that it would be actually with the greenhouse gases. There are other things going on, and which are part of the picture: the renewable portfolio standard, the procurement standard, the decoupling of rates. And I think those pressures have an important effect in sort of pushing the utilities in the right way. Another issue is who's regulated: the retailer, whatever it is, the first seller in California, or the source. I think in some ways that may be more important. And just to repeat what I said before, this is a case where I don't think in the short run the utilities can do a whole lot to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They can change the dispatch order. There's some possibility of co-firing biomass with coal, but there's much less they can do than was the case with SO2 or NOx. The big thing they can do is push conservation and switch to renewables, and the pressure's sort of pointing in that way. But I don't think we should expect the same sort of response with electricity that we got with SO2 or NOx. I think obviously we need to keep the pressure on them, but this is exactly why it's important to deal with the rest of the economy. Let me make one last point. Electricity was responsible for 2/3 of the SO2 emissions nationally. And so if you regulated them effectively, you went a long way to reducing emissions. In California, they're responsible for 20% of our emissions. And if you regulate them, that leaves 80% of the problem untackled. This is why it's such a fundamentally different problem, and why the need is really to push more broadly on sources of emissions. But I think this is a case where the monopoly structure is probably not going to be a big problem.
Thanks.
Okay, please join me in thanking our AB 32 panel.